It's academic and it's theater, the place where they both meet.
We have the audience and participant for each other.
Intellectual practices, historical practices, cultural practices. Everybody, please.
Examples of women
sharing what it is that you do, sharing how you do that.
There's no way you can ignore Latinos anymore.
We're from all around the world. You can come and see and talk about.
He starts out a little thing, right there, you have to do completely full of them.
Theater for everybody, yes, everybody.
That's just what should be done.
And indeed, my understanding of life, relationships, death, has already changed.
The survival of theater as an art form depends on that.
But there's room for it all. There's room for it all.
Welcome everybody to the Martin E. Segal Theatre Center here at the Graduate Center CUNY. My name is Frank Henschke and I'm the Director of Programs. It's really a great honor for us tonight to show you something extremely rare and significant. And I would like to thank everybody involved. Tonight we have, as part of our World Theatre Series, Shūji Terayama, in memory of him and his work, screenings of Americans Who Are You, Laura, and The Trial. And it is extremely rare to see them, especially on 16 millimeter, how they were perhaps intended to see. And we at the Segal Center bridge academia and professional theater, international and American theater. So this is right at the center. And this is like a little petit four and a very special gourmet shop where you really have to know about what you see and what you eat and what you taste. So this is a fantastic evening and we are truly honored. We would like to, I'll come to that later, but we would like to really thank for this support to make this happen. First of all, of course, the Great Japan Foundation, with that foundation that really has supported so many of our programs and significant ones, and really our thanks goes to them, as well as to the Harvard Film Archive, the Anthology Film Archives, the Eastman Museum, the George Eastman Museum, the National Film Center, the National Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo, with the generous support of the Kinoshita Group in collaboration with Go Hirasawa and Julian Ross. So it is, as you can see, really a big production, and many people have worked a lot of hours to make this happen. So thank you for coming. Terayama, as you all know, was one of the great significant artists of the 20th century in the performance art and theater, but also in film, poetry, and television. He was like an Andy Warhol in a way, all of things he will be involved in. Peter Eckersall, my colleague here at the Grad Center, who will share the discussion afterwards, will tell you more and also then introduce the panelists. We will see 3 films and look at your program to follow them rightly. And again, thanks for everybody to have made that happen. It's a fantastic honor. And as we see on a Monday on Thanksgiving, which is everybody told us no one's going to come, we have a full house. So thank you again. If you have a cell phone, please do take it out, and I'll do the same. Just double check. Take a moment. It should say ring or silent, and it never rings in our evenings, and I hope it's not the first one tonight. So really, thank you very much. There will be the screenings will be about 90 minutes, and the discussion will be here, a little reception, and then afterwards we're going to go to the archive bar around the corner, and I hope if you have the time to join us. But right now I would like to ask my colleague Chizuru to give a few remarks about the films of Terayama we're going to see now, and she will be able to tell you much better than I do what this is all about. Thank you.
So thank you everyone for coming tonight. And I'm from National Film Center Tokyo. And this tour, Terayama tour, is our first world premiere of our restored print. So you are going to watch 2 films. The Lola and The Trial is really beautiful archival print that we recently restored. And through the process, like it was very hard to like discover what Terayama did with the film as a color. So I hope you enjoy the beauty of the color itself as a gradation as well. So thank you so much and enjoy the films.
Okay. So again, thank you all for coming, and I hand over to our chair of the panel, Peter.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for, I think it was quite remarkable to see those films, and thank you also for your wonderful performance. Thank you so much. My name is Peter Eckersol, and I'm a professor in the Graduate Centre here in the PhD program in theatre, and my work on Japan is in theatre, so I come to Terayama Shuji through the theatre, but of course I've seen many of the films, but I'm very fortunate to have seen these films tonight. And we do have, I think, a really interesting panel to have, I hope, quite an interesting but unfortunately quite brief discussion tonight, because we have to finish at a certain time. But just very briefly, if I can introduce the panel, on starting from the far left, we have Tom Lucer from New York University. Tom's professor, works in a program in Asian Studies, specialises in Japanese contemporary performance, media and culture. So we welcome Tom. Second, Chizuru Usuri from the National Film Centre, and you brought those wonderful prints to us today. Thank you very much, and I do agree that the restorations are quite remarkable. The colours are quite extraordinary. On my left is Henrikku Terayama. Round of applause for our performer, please. Henrikku is an artist, performer, graphic designer and writer. At the age of 17, he left his family home and joined Terayama Shuji's theatre company, Tenjo Sajiki. I think he's very well known to us who have some familiarity with the company, whether it's in theatre or films or some of the spectacular images that we can see in books and so on. A central figure in the 1960s, he joined the troupe as an actor, a stage manager, sound designer, and eventually became an assistant director for Terayama's film productions. He's also an editor and an art director for the photo books by Nobuyoshi Araki. So quite a remarkable career. Thank you for coming tonight. Just on my right, Julia, I'll have to pronounce Alexzuvia. How did I do? As she's a film scholar from CUNY Brooklyn, so fellow colleague from City University of New York, and she works on Terayama's films. And then further to my right is Alex Zalten, who's a film scholar from Harvard University and works on films in 1960s Japan with a particular interest in Terayama's films. And Alex, of course, has been at the Harvard event for this performance as well. So we thank him for coming down to New York, and really great to have you on the panel tonight. And you know Frank on the end of the chairs there. Perhaps if I could just begin, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the work of Terayama Shuji, the director of these films, but Terayama was a major figure in the 1960s avant-garde of Japan, a key figure in the Japanese theatre, so-called onward theatre scene of the 1960s and 1970s. His company produced many great theatre works, and he was a playwright, director, filmmaker, experimental television producer. He made plays for radio, he wrote songs for Enka, and he was an award-winning poet as well. So he truly is one of the great, most important figures in 1960s, or perhaps in 20th century Japanese film, theatre and literature. And a truly interdisciplinary artist, I think, who was equally interesting in all the forms. As a maker, as you can see, gather from some of the work we've seen tonight, he has some fascinations for certain things. I think he obviously has this very strong fascination for a kind of mixing of the everyday with, the everyday world with fictional realities, moving between the everyday and the fictional and blurring the distinctions between them. He famously made theatre works where audiences would enter the theatre from different entrances and experience a different theatrical experience as a result. In 1975, he made one of his most famous works, Knock, which was a 2-day performance event that took place in many venues across Tokyo, and one's ticket was a map for all the performances that took place in parks, gardens, houses, factories, theatres, and perhaps most notoriously a bathhouse. And one entered the bathhouse not knowing who was the audience and who were the performers and who were simply just people there expecting to have a regular bath. So, which is quite a well-known piece. I think from my interest, I wrote about Terayama in my first book on the 60s avant-garde, and I saw him as one of the most primary thinkers of a tradition in Japan on the avant-garde, particularly with his ideas about the radical imagination, the way that he could think through his cultural vision was, I think, quite extraordinary, turning to the grotesque, the vaudeville, to classical Japanese ghost figures, really bringing together an extraordinary array of influences into his very powerful work. And his company was well known for making extraordinary performances that often involved the audience, if not literally in an audience participation like we just saw, certainly in some kind of repetitious sonic disturbance, some kind of provocation for the audience to endure. Hammers are a frequent feature of his work, and he would often use them in the theatre percussively to, according to people who were there, really to annoy them with the sound that just would continue for a very long time. And there were many other tropes that we can see in his work, the grotesque, the carnival, the focus on, a kind of fascination for fetish objects, and so on and so forth. So I won't continue tonight, but I'm going to ask each of the panelists to speak briefly about well, first of all, I think I'll ask Henrikku to talk about his experience of both participating in this film and then reviving it now for re-performing it and reimagining it in the current era. And then I'll ask each of the panelists to briefly respond to the films that they saw tonight, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So first of all, Henrikku, if I could ask you to speak just a little bit about your experience of, I guess, working with Terayama, working in this film, and both what you were doing back then and how you think about reviving this film now for a kind of retrospective performance in a very different time and place.
とても難しい質問なんですけども1960年代の終わりから83年まで僕は寺山と17年間ずっと一緒に仕事して、それで最初は役者志望だったんだけども、ヘンリックはトゥーマッチ目立ちすぎるから役者は向いてないって言われて、音響のスタッフになって次にステージマネージャーやったりしてました。
It's a very difficult question, but first of all, I was working with Mr. Terayama from the end of the 1960s to 1983. For 17 years, I was working together with him the whole time. And at first, I wanted to be an actor, but I was told that I stood out too much, so I was helping him with sound design.
で、サウンドデザイナーやりながら、劇団のいろんなデザインの仕事も手伝ってました。で、日常生活もそうなんですけども、ずっとほとんど寺山と一緒に生活していました。
I was also helping out with the art design, and in addition, I was living with him the whole time as well.
時代が、それからちょうど30年ちょっと経ったわけなんですけども、すごく変わったと僕は思います。
It's already been 30 years since his works were made, and I think society has changed quite a lot since then.
毎朝寺山さんに電話で呼び出されて、喫茶店に行くわけです。喫茶店で寺山さんは原稿を書いています。
Every every morning I would get a call and we would go to a kissaten or a cafe, and that's where he would write his works.
台本、要するに芝居の台本なんですけども、当時コピーというものがありませんでした。
In terms of the play scripts, we didn't have a copy, no printers no photo printers.
ですから原稿用紙、寺山さんと同じ原稿用紙をもらって、寺山さんの原稿用紙を一時ずっと書き写すわけです。
So I would just endlessly be copying his scripts by hand.
で、役者さんの数だけ書かなきゃいけないので、3枚とか10枚とか同じことを書いてました。
And I repeated that for as many actors as there were, so 3 or 5 times as many actors as there were.
ですから最後はもう寺山さんとそっくりの字になってしまいました。
So by the end, I had almost the same handwriting as Mr. Terayama.
だから今もコピーもあるし、携帯電話もあるしで、だからコミュニケーションっていう風なもののなんていうかな、速さがすごく違ってきてると思います。
Nowadays, we have Xerox machines and phones, and I think the speed of communication has increased so much since then.
だからコミュニケーションが早い方がいいとはあんまり今見てて思わないんですけども、やっぱりなんかコミュニケーションの節度っていうふうなものをみんなそれぞれ考えてほしいと思います。
So I don't necessarily think that faster communication is better, but I do want people to think about the frequency.
今だから映画って言ってこういうふうに16ミリの映写機回す映画なんて、ほとんどの人が知らないし、映画学科の人でさえフィルムの編集もできません。
And I don't think many people on a daily basis get a chance to see 16mm film.
だからビデオで何でもできるようになったんだけども、何でもできることがいいことだとは思わないというのは、想像力がだんだん欠けていくような気がします。
So we have a much more convenient time of taking videos, but I don't think it's necessarily better to be convenient. We need to make sure we have the imagination to value that.
今日は彼が16ミリの音も要するに機械の音も聞かせたいと言ってこういうふうにセッティングしてくれたんですけども、とてもありがたいことだと思います。ありがとうございます。
So today I'm very glad and thankful that Frank suggested that we have the 16mm for the sound of it as well. I'm very thankful.
Thank you very much. So perhaps if I could ask Tom just to make a few comments, and we'll just go along the line a little bit. Yeah?
Sure, just we have some time. We don't feel rushed, so but okay.
Well, I can talk through. I think I'll just talk about the first and the third because the second one I think is more straightforward, although I really like it. And I wanted to say a couple comments about what seems to be the anarchism of the sign that he's playing with, or the kind of radicality that Terayama was playing with. And the first one, the third one, I'll start with the third one, the ones about the nails. The nails themselves seem to be reduced, you can make a story out of it, but they seem to be reduced to a kind of brute materiality of qualities, maybe, and of actions, so that you can see it. A nail could also be a phallus. It could be just a weight. Somebody has to, a load that you have to bear, in other words. It could be a set of acts that involve penetration, etc. They seem to work through the film, and that they exceed the screen itself, so it's a kind of materiality that is immaterial, but it's also physical, that you can participate in, you almost have to participate in, and then questions what kind of materiality is it that you are when you're nailing a nail into the wall there, what are you participating in? It's unclear, right? So there's a kind of radical uncertainty that attaches to the sign of the nail, or the nail as a sign, that you only can figure out by deciding for yourself. That quality of having to decide for yourself is part of the anarchism. Typically a nail would be used, for instance, to build a structure. The question then becomes, well, what kind of structure of meaning are you using those nails, or are you participating in when you're hammering those nails into that screen/wall? It's really unclear. That could be a problem, maybe not. I think it's an interesting sort of radicality at that point that seems to be more visible and perhaps more pessimistic in the first one, the documentary. And in that documentary, in some ways, in the very first scene with the father and the son, you can see the kind of imposition of political meaning that the father is attaching to the son. The son is almost incomprehending of the questions. He has no idea how to answer them or even necessarily what the questions are, but the father is essentially telling the kid how to respond in apparently politically appropriate responses like Cassius Clay, great guy, or something like that. But again, you can see even at the level of clear politics, that's not real politics at all. That's simply the imposition of meaning. And after that, basically, the film seems to devolve into a set of randomized questions that reduce the questions' difference themselves to something like digital information, where you just say, what you had for breakfast is the same thing as answering whether you like your friends or your country better. And so then the only way you can say that series of documentary questions would add up to something would, again, sort of like the nails in the structure, be a structure that you would have to impose. But in this case, it almost seems to resist that. There's no way for me that I could come away from that documentary saying, this is what Terayama wants you to see about America. This is what all those questions add up to. In which case, it's actually really kind of nihilistic. It's kind of empty of any meaning at all. And so that seems to be one potential carry-through of precisely the radical anarchistic qualities of the Terayama sign, that ultimately there is no sociality, there is no commonality, there is no meaning. It becomes a kind of negativity. So some of the radicality seems to be this tension between a really productive openness and an absolutely emptiness of the sign itself.
Great, thank you very much. We're going to come back to many of these questions in our discussion, so but we'll move along our circle for now. Sui-san, could you speak a little bit about your interest in Terayama, and also, I guess, because you're also representing the National Film Archive, and obviously Terayama's status as a filmmaker is extremely important in Japan. Perhaps you could say something about that as well.
私多分高校生ぐらいの時に初めて寺山さんの詩集を読んだのが初めじゃないかなと思うんですけど、それはすごく少女的な少女を扱ったものだったんですね。でその後は多分20歳ぐらいの時に長編作品をいくつか見たのが次の出会いで、で今回フィルムセンターの人間として復元自体には技術的に関わってないんですが、この企画を通して寺山修司の作品がどうやってフィルム上で再現されるのかということを、勉強してきたわけなんですけれども、その中でものすごいその実景映画の監督ってもちろんマテリアルにすごく向かっていくんですが、寺山監督が本当にそのいろいろなことを絶妙にコントロールしているんだなというふうに私自身はすごい感じました。
So my first exposure with Terayama was his poetry book when I read it in high school, which includes the very prominent girl character. And in my 20s later I saw his full-length films, and now today I'm here as part of the National Archives, as you mentioned. But I didn't necessarily work on the restoration myself, but in the process I was able to learn how these films work. And so in terms of my interest with the Terayama films, I agree with the materiality, but I also think that he has a very high degree of control that he exerts in the films.
ちょっとテクニカル的な技術的なことになっちゃうんですけれども、今回その復元でフィルムセンターがものすごく頑張ったなと自負しているのは、フィルムセンターのようなフィルムアーカイブにおいて復元をする、再度プリントを焼くという時にどれだけオリジナルに近づけるかというのがとても重要なポイントです。
So I'm going to speak a little bit about the technical aspects. So one of the things that the archives is very careful about, usually one tries to make the original as close to the, make the restoration as close to the original in terms of color as possible.
その中で寺山修司監督が実際にそのプリントを焼いていた時代と現代ではいわゆるフィルムを焼く機械というものが方法が全然違うんですね。
The printing machines that Mr. Terayama would have had are completely different to the ones that we have today.
なので今回の復元においてはちょっと今日は上映がなかった作品なんですけれども例えばその、リファレンスとできるような寺山修司監督がまだご存命中に焼いているプリントというのをまず私たちはその色の基本にしました。
We used a film which was not screened today that he had printed at the time as a reference to base our color off of.
もしその頃の技術者の方とかが残っていたらその人たちにも話を聞いてやるようにしていました。
And we also contacted the technicians that he worked with at the time, if possible, to ask and confirm if they were the right colors.
そんな中で昔のそのプリンターの色を再現するということでももちろんかなり苦労したんですけれども、同時にその昔のプリンターのある種その可能な領域の幅をかなり広く使ってこの寺山修司監督っていうのは作品を作っていたなというのが、復元を通して分かりました。
So in addition to being as loyal to the original as possible, we were able to find out that Mr. Terayama used a very wide, he really broadened the spectrum of color possible in the printing process at the time.
私はすごいそうやって技術的なラボのことも本当に分かってる人だったんだって実は感動してアメリカにやってきたんですけれども、さっきこの旅の間ヘンリクさんと話したら実はそうでもなかったのかもしれないというかかなりカメラマンの方がすごいそこは頑張って、それに対して寺山さんがそうなんだそうだねっていう感じでやっていたのかなというのが分かりました。
So I was initially very moved in the lab to discover this, but as I came here to America this time and I was speaking to Mr. Henrikku, I realized, or Mr. Henrikku pointed out to me that that might not have been the case, and it might have just been a choice of the cameraman.
なのでちょっとこの後またアンソロジーフィルムアーカイブスなどでも上映があるのでぜひ他の短編作品も見ていただけたらと思うんですけれども、当時の色を再現するために例えば白黒のハイコントラストのネガを使って撮影されているものをカラーに焼くときにさまざまなフィルターを使ってさらにその明るさがなくなってしまうのをきちっと適切なものにするために今度はボルトを上げてというような数多くのテストをした上でのニュープリントを今回持ってきていますので、ぜひたくさん見ていただけたらなと思います。
So we've made a lot of accomplishments with restorations at the archives, so I would love if you could come see them at some point. We've worked on making sure the black and white, high contrasts, and the colors are very loyal to the original, so I hope you can see that.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate this very, very technical discussion alongside the kind of cultural reading of the film. I think they go very nicely together, and we'll talk about the copy perhaps a little bit later on. But perhaps we could have your response now.
Great. So since I'm sure these are quite controversial and interesting films, I'll keep my response rather brief. But I just wanted to touch on a couple of rather important points, I think, in Terayama's work. The first of which is the concept of everything as theater, as everything turned into theater, a radical theatricalization, really, of everyday life. So at first you might not think that this as being particularly tied to something like the 1920s in places like the Soviet Union, but actually I think there is quite an important tie to filmmakers of the former Soviet Union who wanted to rid film, right, of fictionality. But what actually Terayama is doing by imposing fictionality on everyday life becomes a rather similar project, where in this process of turning the everyday, turning the post office, and he has a quote about everything, the post office, the street, the grocery store, everything being turned into theater, it becomes actually a rather similar radicalization of everyday life experience, and has rather parallel goals, I think, to this early period in film history. Another thing I wanted to touch upon is his desire to create a dialogue between the viewer and the filmmaker, and the viewer and the film. So this endlessly porous space where there is, as everyone witnessed in especially the second and third films, this creation of a porous space between the viewer and the filmmaker, and the ability of this very rare interpenetration, which was, according to Terayama, one of his main purposes for making art, and specifically making films. Another point I wanted to talk about was that for Terayama, the idea of play is quite serious, right? So his films are very playful, and this is something that I think many people noticed. The first film is rather funny. There was a lot of laughter. There's a lot of, sort of playful, joking responses, but this is actually quite serious, right? So something that is very, very playful is simultaneously a very serious act. And, we can probably talk in the Q&A about what exactly, how it's serious, and what he means by play, and what is playful in Terayama. But it's an important thing to think about. Something that he used to call his what is called in English the sort of ceiling gallery, which he called how he called his performances, performers, is sometimes sort of subtitled the laboratory of play, which I think is rather interesting. Both play as theater and also play as a space of, free aesthetic play, or something that you can undergo as if you were a child engaging in a space like the cinema or the theater. And just a couple of other notes. In the first film that we watched, I don't think it was an accident that the first few interviewees were black, because actually Terayama sort of famously noted that he considered himself a black version of a Japanese man, which is rather strange and controversial in its own right, but he really thought of himself as participating in this sort of more, sort of discriminated person, because he came from Aomori, which is from the north of Japan, and he was considered to have been rather large, and so he sort of thought of himself weirdly as a black Japanese man. And so I don't think it's an accident that, of course it could it's just my thought, that the first few interviewees that we see happen to be black Americans. And the last thing I just wanted to mention is the idea that Terayama had of theater being a crime. And he wanted this, right? For him, a theatrical experience has to somehow be criminal, and he really praised this about both cinema and the theater. And so it was very common for him to get into a lot of trouble in his theatrical performances, but this is something he wanted. It's his iconoclasm, his tendency for these sort of radical nihilistic acts that tended to, get him into trouble, but also revealed, I think, something very profound about what he viewed filmmaking to be. So.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you. Alex?
Watching these films again, it just reminded me of how far what Terayama is doing goes beyond film, or goes beyond maybe even any of the single media that he was working in. Someone who's now a very well-known professor of media studies in Japan was a graduate student in New York in the 1980s, and was tasked with driving around Nagisa Oshima, who's one of the best-known Japanese directors of the 60s and 70s, when he was visiting New York for a retrospective. And he asked him, he told me this once, he asked him, well, who do you consider your greatest rival in the world of Japanese film? And he told me he's now very embarrassed about asking a question like that. But Oshima responded in saying, well, clearly that's Terayama Shuji. And I just couldn't compete in the end. There was no way I could compete with Terayama. And at the time, this struck my acquaintance as very strange. Terayama is known as someone who worked in many, many different fields, but because of that, in some way, he's also not really known primarily as a film director or so. So he just didn't understand why would someone like Oshima, who's seen as one of the great masters of Japanese cinema, feel that he couldn't compete with Terayama. From, I think, watching something like this, and if you have a chance to see some of the films that are showing at the Anthology Film Archives in the next few days, I think you'll understand this, it'll make sense to you too. It's partially because Terayama is going well beyond what Oshima can do. He's not trying to tell stories. He's not creating single works that convey a kind of narrative or even a kind of message of sorts. What he's doing is really going beyond something like, he's doing world building, and that's a very new kind of strategy at that point in time. He's creating a gigantic kaleidoscope going across different media, connected through different motifs, through themes, through kind of narrative fragments that pop up again and again in different kind of variations. And through that, he sets the media against each other, creating these weird overlaps and tensions. And those, in that interplay, they create a whole variety of new media. It's really a kaleidoscopic kind of strategy. As Julia said, that extends beyond just kind of the world of the mediated, right? So this goes, well, reaches into the everyday and tries to utilize the everyday as kind of fragments of information and parts of what might become a work in a sense as well. There's a one of the very famous examples of this is when Terayama helps to organize an actual funeral for a fictional character from a famous boxing manga called Tomorrow's Joe, after that character dies in the manga. And several hundred people come to attend, and there's this big news in the newspapers. And the newspaper headlines are like, this is scary, this is weird, people are going to a funeral for a fictional character. There are several other examples in the following years, so this becomes much more kind of less worthy of being reported upon in newspapers. But at the time, this was quite shocking. But it's 2 weeks after this funeral that the Japanese Red Army hijacks the Yodogo airplane, a passenger airplane, from Narita Airport and flies it to Pyongyang in North Korea. And they issue a manifesto as they do this. And the final sentence of the manifesto reads, "We are tomorrow's Joe." So even the radical left is not quoting Marx or Lenin, they're referring to a manga, right? So something is changing significantly, and Terayama is someone who really has his finger on the pulse in this, and he's trying to utilize these changing sensibilities, the way we're constantly entangled with media, the way we can't be separated from them anymore. And he sees that as working, for that he works across the entire spectrum. And the way that he kind of calls the audience to action, to pick up the hammer, without really telling you what it might mean to pick up the hammer, but first of all, pick it up and do something, right? Try to generate some kind of action that leads to something. That's part of that larger project, I think.
Thanks very much, Alex. And I very much appreciate the focus on action. And it's a strong interest of mine in relating the theatre to the milieu of the times. And that time and time again, you look at the records, whether it's the artistic practices or indeed the manifesto of student protest groups or radical protest groups. And there's this really repetitious focus on action above anything else almost. It's the uber keyword of the period. So thank you very much. I think that those comments are all very helpful in helping us understand something about something more about the nature of this remarkable performance and films that we've seen. And I think it's now a time that we'll go to the audience. And please, if you've got a question, please perhaps indicate who you would like to answer it, because we've got rather a large panel here. So there's one just there. Yeah. And please keep your questions brief, because we will have a reception. So
just a brief comment. I've been exploring experiential storytelling, and this is what really touched me. And I thought of two quotes, one by Saul Bellows, which says, we're so shock resistant, maybe the only thing that can touch us is poetry. And I see that, as well as a quote by Peter Brook, which says that this is our playground. And I get that feeling he's playing with us. And that my question is, what is the sexual element in his time, in his culture? Because here we were founded by Puritans. I have no concept of the Japanese sense of sexual innuendo. Can you get anybody comment on that?
Perhaps if we could just put it out there as a provocation and a question to think about. I'm sure we all have perspectives on that, but would you like to say anything about that in particular? Or perhaps some other members of the panel? The reason I'm hesitating is it's probably a very large question to answer, and it would take quite a while.
I think if I can just say that whatever sexual mores are, if the question is about sexual mores in Japanese society, then Terayama is clearly trying to go against the status quo, right? So I'm not sure if the films necessarily reveal what is the average, sexual experience of our nature of sexuality in Japan, but rather he's always trying to go towards a very, very uncomfortable location. For instance, in Emperor Tomato Ketchup, right, one of his most famous films that was also has a long and short version, there's an infamous sequence with many prepubescent children appearing to, they're feigning sexual activity, but pretty much, there is sexual activity with adults and even middle-aged people, and it's a extremely controversial sequence. But you clearly can't look at that and make something, up about Japanese sexual mores, because he's just going so far into the extreme of the opposite, right? So
we are in a context where a lot of artists are experimenting with, I guess, physicality in the body, and I think that that's also a very prominent experience for many artists of that particular generation. But there's also this very lively sense of play, but also fascination for particular repetitious actions, I think, is something that comes up again and again in many, not just Terayama, but many of the other, perhaps you could compare that to some of the Buto performances of the time, for example. Yeah.
I was wondering if anybody could address how Mr. Terayama was seeing his work in relation to the work of other directors in Europe and in America at the time. Maybe if Mr. Morisaki could tell us if there was any particular director outside of Japan that he admired or he spoke about.
寺山その当時一番好きなのは、日本の、今村昌平監督なんですが、それともう一人はやっぱりフェデリック・フェリーニが一番好きでした。で演劇の方では、カントールとか、アラバールと交友がありました。
So at the time, he was interested in the Japanese director Shohei Imamura and Frederick Fellini, and in terms of performing arts, Kantor and Arabar, he had relations with them.
でロバート・ウィルソンもとても一番最初見た時にびっくりして、こんなことができるんだったらっていうふうに思ってました。
And apparently, Robert Rousseau also, when he saw the films, he rediscovered the potential of what is possible.
So it's Robert Wilson, not Robert Rousseau.
あとは忘れちゃった。
I forgot.
イタリアの監督というか演劇の演出家のロンコニーっていう人がいるんですけども、彼の演劇は非常に暴力的で、寺山を超えるぐらいに暴力的だったんですけども、寺山はそれに負けないように暴力的な演劇を作ろうとしました。
In Italy, there was also Ronconi, director Ronconi, and Terayama noticed how violent his performances were and always aspired to be as violent.
The other really interesting aspect of this is that of the 60s generation, Terayama was popular in Europe. His work toured, whereas many of the other generation of artists at that time did not tour their work to Europe. Karajuro only toured in Asia. Buto companies were later than Terayama to go to the world, and so I think there was this. Terayama was a very interesting case of a Japanese avant-garde that had some relationship to European audiences.
He performed, remember, at La Mama.
Performed at La Mama, absolutely. Yeah.
だからラママでもやらせてもらって、とても好評だったんですけども、その寺山の作品は外国の人の方がなぜか理解する。それはね、多分言葉ではないものを理解してるんだと思うんです。だから言葉で伝えられないものの方が実は多いと思います。
As you mentioned, also La Mama, but I think his works were popular overseas because there was something beyond words that was being communicated, that was being reached to these audiences in his works.
We probably have time for one more question, do we? Okay, sorry. Yeah, I thought we had to finish.
僕はラママのステージやってる前だって言います。でエピソードが一つあるんです。所作台って分かりますかね。能の舞台でも歌舞伎の舞台でも所作台っていう台は決まってるんですよね。だけどそれをね、オープニングの前の日にね、寺山さんは尺開けてくれって言ったんです。尺開けるということはそこがないわけでしょ。尺12センチですけどね。それで役者さんどうするんですかって言ったら、バカな役者は落ちればいいって言った。それ言っていただけますか。
So this is Mr. Maeda. He performed for La Mama, and so he was mentioning that there is usually a set for no or kabuki performances, but for the performance for Mr. Terayama, he told us to get rid of it, and so it wasn't. There was no there was no space.
開けた理由はね、そこに歌舞伎の伝統の落としがあるんですよ。それをね、日本からわざわざ書いて持ってきたんです。落としですね。で、それがね、その落ちた時に舞台に残るわけでしょ。で、歌舞伎ではそれを袖で弾くんですよ。右手も左手でもどっちでもいいですけど、寺山さんはね、それを下まで落とせ。それでそこは尺開いたっていうことは日本でもないです。
So,
歌舞伎の舞台を開ける人はいないんです。
The episode that he is sharing with us reveals that Mr. Terayama completely changed the conventions for the performance of the no kabuki at the time. Which wasn't done in Japan. There is a dropping performance that's usually swept away to the side, but by keeping that space open, he said just drop it straight through. So he changed the conventions of that performance entirely, is what that episode.
This is a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much, all of you, for your comments. And yes, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. And I just happened to have the good fortune of meeting Mr. Terayama years ago. In fact, I saw the third film in '75 or '6 in California. It was shown there once at the University of the Pacific. And
I got to know him a little bit, and I know that one thing he was trying to do, which is kind of alluded to by several of you, was almost, we could call it like meta theater or meta filmmaking. These things are about the making process itself, the creative process itself. And if there's any ultimate goal in there, you want people to question things. What is theater? That's those questions in the first one. Who am I? Who are you? What are you? These are really profound questions when you start thinking about them. And I think he wanted people to think about those sorts of things. And in one of his plays, he's got the characters controlled by puppets, strings. And as the play is dissolved, and the actors come out on stage, and he just wants people to talk about that. You know, who's controlling these people? Who's controlling you? And then ultimately he says, and how do you believe anybody there? How can you even believe the playwright?
That's a really, I'm envious that you actually met Terayama Shuji, but it's a fantastic experience, and it's a really interesting comment. I think the first thing I ever saw was an essay that was published in TDR, which was the Tenjo Sajiki Manifesto of the time. And I'm sure some of you have seen this. The way that it was printed was that it was intentionally illegible. So you had to read across light and dark sections of the page in order to put the sentences together. So there's constantly this kind of deferral of meaning, but also this invitation to come into this kind of meta spectatorship, I guess, or meta theatrical event. So it's a really fascinating comment that you've made, I think. So thank you.
最後に一つ。
はい、どうぞ。
寺山はカメオに光ってました。
He was wearing a turtleneck. Oh, he was. Oh, he had a pet turtle. I'm sorry.
で、一つの名前が答え、一つの名前がクエスチョン、質問でした。
One turtle was named question and the other was named answer.
それで、どっちのカメが大きかったかというと、質問、クエスチョンの方でした。
And in terms of which turtle was larger, it was the question turtle.
どうしてですかって聞いたら、質問の中に答えはたくさん隠されているということでした。
When I asked him why, he said there are many answers inside of question.
それで、寺山の残した言葉なんですが、私は偉大な人間にはなりたくはないです。私は大きな大きな質問になりたいですっていうのが寺山の言葉でした。質問。
These are Terayama's words. I don't want to become a large person. I want to become a large, large question mark.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Sometimes you have the perfect end to a symposium, and I think we just had it there. So always think to the big turtle. But just before we go tonight, and we are going to have a reception, I'd just like to thank one or two people. Frank also mentioned so many of the people who put this event together, the very many organizations that have sponsored this event. And once again, so thank you to the Harvard Film Archive, the Anthology Film Archives, the George Easton Museum, the Japan Foundation, the National Film Center, the National Museum of Modern Art, and the generous support of the Kinoshita Group. We also thank Go Hirasawa and Julian Ross, both of whom couldn't be here, but it was actually Go-san who came to us first and said, hey, we're having this film exhibition in town, do you want to do this component of it? And we immediately, well, actually Frank immediately said yes. And the next group of people I need to thank Frank and the Segal Center, because Frank and his staff really do the impossible sometimes. They're a small public programs organization, a part of the Graduate Center of the City of University of New York, very much attached to the PhD program in theater, but you know, basically they are Frank and the staff you see here tonight and all of the people who've really put this together. So thank you, Frank, and thank you to all of the staff. And thank you to everybody for coming out tonight. Please join us for a short celebration, short kampai.
And to remark on your call to action, maybe if you want, 9 of the hammers are up for grabs, so you can take them home and continue hammering. One we're going to keep here at the Segal, and we're going to have a reception here, not for too long, 10, 15 minutes, and then walk over to the archive bar, which is on 36 between 5th and Madison. It's in your program, and hope you can join us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.